Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's July the 26th, and it's at the peak of Prairie expression in this season of the year. So if you get a chance to look at a little prairie, do so. It's interesting and exciting. I was pleased to be listening to the music on Friday night, and many people come by and we chat, and some of those people actually hear this program on Channel 6 and it goes up to YouTube. So that's kind of friendly because we don't have a Nielsen rating on this sort of programming. So we don't know how many people listen to what we're talking about, and it's very various. I would start by saying that Ron Slater came by from Decatur. He's been a chemist with ADM, and he brings herbicide, which we're very careful to use to spot herbicide. We don't blanket herbicide, we spot herbicide, teasel. And teasel is a very elegant plant. Some of it is 10 feet tall at the present time, and it has a very elegant pod on it, which is used for teasing wool in early days, so that you could spin wool and it would be kind of even without lumps in it. And so that's the name for the plant, which is a very attractive dried arrangement that gets into wreaths, and we're near a cemetery, so the pod has a zillion seeds, so it adds to the seed pool in the soil and can grow for years hence. It's a biennial, so the first year it creates a rosette and then gradually grows to a mature plant, and it's a survivor. Its leaves catch water, a little bit like a cup plant, and it can survive, especially where the soil is soft. If you had a little bit of cultivation, then teasel will enjoy that. It doesn't really enjoy being on our past era gravel pit, which is basically glacial till going back 10,000 years. So we have a prairie that is remnant on the outer skirts and on a nearby abandoned interurban, but on the gravel pit, the seed has been coming back to nature probably for 75 or 80 years since the gravel pit was closed. It was the glacial till is an excellent road pack. So we got there early. We have a gate at each end of that little road that used to be Route 45. And that's our access. We have a gate at the north end and a gate at the south end, and that prevents untoward dumping, and it prevents off-road vehicles from screwing around on things. To put you in context, and we've done it several times before, the Pope Prairie, so named because a road went out around a cemetery, and it was a good visual corridor for the Pope family Champaign-Urbana sign company, billboards. So they took advantage. So we bought from the Polk family when 57 went in. There was intended to be some changes in the road north out of Rantoul. A dual highway had been established between Rantoul and Banner, but then it was going to be extended to the north. Perhaps that was for the movement of military people from the Air Force Base in and out in case of emergency. But we were not sure why the change, but it was decided that 57 should go in to the west, so that obsoleted the intended dual highway north. A portion of that dual highway around the cemetery was obsoleted and has been planted by the Department of Transportation that still owns the bed to ash trees and cypress, which trees, the cypress has invaded our prairie next door, and the ash trees have come to emerald ash borer. So going back to Rantoul, if you take Route 45 to Rantoul, you move through Rantoul. Just at the north edge of Rantoul, there is a east-west railroad bed that has been abandoned, and there is a 3-mile rail trail through the north part of Rantoul. We pay attention to that because it adds dimension to the idea of taking a rail trail north to 10 miles to Paxton and perhaps further to Kankakee and involving ecotourism. So you want to know what people can see. If you go east on the east-west railroad line, you go to Dillsburg and Gifford, and there the Grand Prairie Friends has 1 mile of short line prairie. So we're working with a moraine. The old road came south from Chicago, south to Paxton, which was then called Prospect, and further south to Ludlow, and then gradually up to a moraine, which is known as the Bloomington Moraine. And that was where Glacier was located for many years. And that's where the front of the glacier melted and left Rock and Robo, which becomes a moraine. That was 10,000 years ago, and Prairie has had a chance to come back in as the native ecosystem. There was a little bit of forest here and there, but very little. Champaign County was 94% prairie. And so as we drive north on 45, you're paralleling the railroad line, but you're going to have to go out around a kind of historic cemetery. That gives you a lot of history of the early settlement. The road at the back, the old road to Egypt, like Cairo in the south, was highway width, but not dual highway width. So coming out of Rantoul, the highway that is the present Route 45 moves out and around this cemetery. That leaves some of this open space that was going to be the second dual of the dual highway and never was. So we go north to the first section road north of the cemetery, and then drive about 100 yards, and onto the old Route 45. Now, if you stand there and look, you'll realize that what was intended was the dual highway was going to go back onto the old Route 45 and go all the way to Kankakee on that old road. It didn't happen. The road was confined to one highway, and that was a new highway, which is Route 45. So you can stand at the north end and look back and see where our prairie is. It's that triangle north of the cemetery. South of the cemetery, there is another triangle, which is wetland, which we would love to have as a demonstration of what the area looked like before early settlement. The extra dual highway that's not being used will dovetail gently onto old 45. That was, as I imagine, the plan. Storms have taken down 2 trees, so I was ready to take down the tree so we would have access down the old Route 45. I did that and then took a video camera loaned to us by Havana Public Television and made 45 20 to 40 minute clips of the landscape so that you would see the borrow pit or gravel pit prairie that has taken out 8 feet of glacial till, and you would see the remnants around it, which were not disturbed, and the remnants on an old interurban. So if you went from west to east, you would go from Mainline to Canadian National, which in those days was Illinois Central. Then there was a Kankakee interurban, which has been long since abandoned. But since it was a lightweight rail, it had not a very deep ballast and soil. So on that interurban, there is good prairie, a remnant prairie. And that helps to seed the gravel pit, which is on the triangle itself between the cemetery and the peak of where the modern Route 45 turns parallel to the railroad again. There is a 5-acre lot just between our gravel pit prairie and the cemetery. There was vacant space for farmland, and the cemetery has bought 6 acres, and we have the opportunity to buy 6 acres. It's rather interesting and attractive because it has been fallowed for a long time. The cemetery has mainly prairie grasses on it. It's reserved for the future. And there's an access road, and the north piece of 5 acres between the cemetery reserve and the Pope Prairie is alive with planted prairie. So it's cooperative. At the moment, it's alive with monarda or bibom. There is baptisia, and there's yellow coneflower and sunflowers and various legumes that I'm trying to think of the name. Partridge pea is there. So it's a kind of an artificial prairie, but it sort of would help to save the soul of the 9-acre prairie adjacent to it. So I have photographs there, and we spent a good day. In the process, I encountered a phenomenon that is rather unusual. It is not always seen by people. It is common to mycologists or people who work with fungi. This was about a 30-foot circle, a 30-foot diameter circle of fungi, I think, by the name of Boletaceae. It's a fungi that has an erect stalk about a foot high with an open mushroom head that is about 10 inches wide and fairly flat. It's so the mushrooms sort themselves out on the perimeter of this circle. Basically, the area in the middle is necrosis, and the fungi, their mycelia, are moving out to the edge, and the active edge is where you have a ring of fungi, often referred to as a fairy ring, because you can imagine. So let's imagine that you're sitting on a tree which happens to be in the center of this circle, and you're sitting there with your guitar or you're reading a book, and you're watching the activities of fairies resting underneath the Boletaceae fungi, the fruiting bodies, and they're fairly common. Some of them are upturned a little and interesting because of that. If you're going to photograph them, you have to get down on your belly and be at their height. They probably won't last a long time because they will ripen, and they have little flanges and millions of spores. So from a botanical point of view, you can cut off the stalk and put the head of the mushroom on a paper and let it dry, and the spores will make a pattern, and that pattern will help you to define the species of the fungus that you're dealing with. If you're a fairy and you're sitting there playing your flute underneath the fungus, then you can imagine spores raining down on your head and tickling your nose. There may be a gnome sitting on top of all these fungi, but whatever, you have to exercise your imagination, and artists enjoy visiting a fairy ring. Some people are researchers, and they can use this fungi sometimes to create a biological control, because it's obvious that there's chemicals in the center of this ring that are poisonous. They're poisonous to the mycelia itself that creates the circle. So they work on the new edge. And so if you're interested in biological control of one fungus over another, you may want to research the biochemicals that are involved. This is possibly a 50-year project with laboratories and a costly venture, but this is how we decide on future herbicides and their role in agriculture. So if there is money in the pharmaceuticals, perhaps a medical involvement, then or in agriculture, then you do get the research money to do this sort of work. It's a little of a gamble. Many of the advantages we take of nature by guesswork. You find out that this particular plant will provide a chemical that will control or be a medicine for the future. Sometimes that chemical is taken over as a universal response, and that's not quite so wonderful because it's a monoculture rather than a biodiversity. I was talking to someone that I've known for a long time at the music festival, and he had been listening to me talk about these things, and we were talking about how the roots of plants and how the mycelium interact with each other, and they're associates, so that sometimes you will have a group of trees, and if you don't have one part of the associate, the whole forest will die. It's very, very subtle, and we have a lot of work to do in that direction if we to use biological associations or controls. The associations will allow plants to grow better and do well. In some cases, you will find that if you don't have the vital chemical involved that is sort of floating through the soil and then through the atmosphere, then your crop will die. Interestingly, at the moment, you're having moisture and humidity and warmth, and this promotes the fungi. So I thought that was interesting, and sent pictures off to people who work with this sort of research. Now, having looked at the area itself many times, we have to get more sophisticated. It's perfectly obvious if you're going to talk about one species of fungi, you almost have to have a team of people investigating that one plant or insect or bird, and it's impossible for us to do that sort of work by the seat of our pants or through volunteerism or through the incitement of one or two individuals. So there's some politics here that we have to look at. The 2 vacant pieces of land are already working with prairie. We have the remnant prairie and the gravel pit prairie to the north. And then that old road runs north to Paxton, and we would like to encourage the Department of Transportation, which owns most of the roadside management area, and we have to find out who might own the interurban that's abandoned. This requires a lot of coordination. And one of the things that interested me this morning was that the Black community broadcasts on WEFT were targeting Black community youths that often drop out of high school before they graduate, and they have a program that for people between 16 and 24 that uh, looks at problems like this. Uh, uh, it's a program run out of the housing division, the housing authority, and they're looking at various disciplines where young folk can come and look to see if they would like to do more training. There's a boot camp, and the boot camp is not an army hard luck thing where you have to work like crazy and you almost drop dead. This is a boot camp to see if you can find students that are interested in joining such a program. So you may have 50 people come because their parents sort of say so, or they're interested, but not everyone is interested. But they give you enough information, enough opportunity for you to decide as a student whether you would like to be there. And they pick 20, and those 20 people have to have a commitment. That means they have to arrive early in the morning and arrive. And if they come in the afternoon, they have to be there in the afternoon and be responsible. So there's a contract here. And on Saturday, when I'm speaking, there will be a graduation for these students, and there will be follow-up to see whether they can be employed. That's part of the program, helping them to get employed, and to see that they maintain that employment and what might be the problems so associated. So I was interested in that because some years ago, some 35 years ago, President Nixon was giving the cities small amounts of money for city improvement. And we decided to create a Black History mural on Park Street. And we were familiar with people who lived in the North End, named people who had grown up there and were part of a neighborhood where everyone would teach everyone else, and there was a community camaraderie. So that Black History mural involved the leadership of Angela Rivers, who was a graduate in art at the time and could create a history mural. And she would draw it. We had a cooperative building owner, and Angela drew the basics, and a team of associates, young people, came to paint by numbers. And the early crew had a hard time getting up to get there. The late crew didn't want to leave. So it has been there for years. We've had to cancel it because the building has been taken down, and it would have cost us $50,000 to prepare a wall and recreate the mural. But it served its purpose, and it brought me into contact with a lot of the families involved. Just across the road was Lucy Gray and her husband, and they would house students that couldn't be on campus after sunset. And it was probably only a tacit rule, but it was there. And it was right opposite the mural. And Lucy would get out there and applaud what was going on. Some people would say the whites, the eyes were too white and the black was too black. But basically, we got a lot of accolades for that mural, and it did a lot of silent history. So something of the same is happening with the housing project. So I'm recording early in the hopes that I can go to the Saturday graduation ceremony in downtown Champaign at the Hyatt Hotel. In that process, we met up with, we had other interests. It's axiomatic that most of the people that go to the conservation meetings are all white. I have been to hundreds of meetings where there was either none or one black person. We were associated with a guy named Lewis Hunley, who had been in the, I think, the Tuskegee unit that did a lot of flying of planes in the Middle East, in the Italy area, and he came back and had the GI Bill. So I think he not only graduated, I think he had a master's degree in landscape architecture. I had a fairly large family that became school teachers and are well known around. And Lewis got jobs working on landscape things, but it was always hard for him to get past the ceiling to where he could be a leader in this sort of thing. So so one of the aspects of housing is that most of the, or a lot of the landscapers are Black community landscapers that are working with housing. And how do you take them to the next level? We have little booklets that tell people about some of the 20 or 30 plants that are part of the 110 broadleaves and 6 grasses that would be found native. Unfortunately, we're down to 0.01% of those places being saved. So how do you take someone who is dropping out of high school to that level? You need people like Lewis Hunley that could lead and had a landscaping company working with his sons. And there's a lot of education needed in between. So I'm thinking about that, and perhaps in a near future, we'll do some of that sort of thinking. We could have people who currently mow excessively change dimensions and think about tending the plants that are prairie plants and eliminating the invasive plants like autumn olive and honeysuckle and the like. So it was interesting to just discuss this, not only at WEFT, but at the music festival right outside our door. Now, I'm watching the time. So last week we talked about the Mayo people who moved west as grandfather, probably born in 1835 and ready to be a doctor in the 1860s when Indians were still being put on reserves or starved and objecting. And this was also at the time of Civil War. So you have to know that gradually the father had to do battle with lots of quack doctors who could put up a shingle and claim that they'd been trained to be a doctor but weren't. But he gradually moved around Minnesota, looking at the open space, looking at the forests and the lakes, and getting to know the territory, and settled down in a place called Rochester. And he gradually got to be accepted as a leader in the community. His operations were successful, and he had two sons that became his assistants. He had a wife who was very knowledgeable, so that if he was out of town, she could do medical things that were important. And gradually the Mayo Clinic has grown. The two sons became outstanding specialists in not only in surgery, but also in medicine, and are known worldwide. So their clinics and establishments have constant visitors, and they go out to pick up information. And we're in something the same boat in a much more primitive level. We need those two brothers who grew up and followed father and started to get involved. So if you go back to the mural situation, the black mural, you're looking for the families, the Rivers, the Hunleys, the Roy Williams, the Pelmores, and you're looking for something of an establishment which would be a leadership. So how do we do that? We don't know. We keep learning. You start off as amateurs and you start to dream. One of the dreams is to establish trust. That means that the general public can know where funds are being utilized, where interests are. And at the moment, some of our help in natural areas and in prairie preservation has been by the seat of the pants. We have lacked money, and we have lacked the broad-based leadership which makes it possible to do interesting things. Basically, we have been inspiring things like the Kickapoo Trail or trails in Monticello, and preservation. In one case, the reestablishment of a railroad line. We would like to get historic trains into Champaign from Monticello. But the next level is to get to be more sophisticated, to have more people at the CEO level, the leadership level, that don't exactly know all the details, but they know how to bring people together. They don't operate like loners. They are able to bring several people together to operate on a problem. And Grand Prairie Friends, which we had a lot of to do with establishing, has been doing this and doing it very well and bringing people together. They still have some problems with not having a very biodiverse population of supporters, but that can happen too. So I'm taking this week people up to Rantoul with a view to seeing how we might put together trust where you can not just utilize support by the city of Paris, but you as a not-for-profit organization like Heartland Pathways can go to a trust, and the trust can adjudicate on what you might do in the future, what you might assign to education, what you might assign to transplantation. Perhaps you need greenhouses. Perhaps you need to train people how to not mow, but to cultivate or encourage plants. So that's what the evil intent of some of these talks is to look at other people, look at other organizations. One of the most interesting has been the establishment of a Prairie State Conservation Coalition. We have to give credit to Fran Hardy, who was a regional director for the Department of Natural Resources and knew this area well. And he and others saw the need for an organization that would bring together people who have established trusts. Many of them are in the Chicago area because that's where there's finance and the need to establish natural areas before they totally disappear, and there is money. So gradually over a 10 or 15-year period, the Prairie State Conservation Coalition has established itself, and it has a seminar and workshop each year, which I find very valuable. They bring in experts like people from the Nature Preserves Commission, lawyers, people who might want to qualify the natural areas they have. It's called certification. And if you have a series of landscapes you own as a park district or a forest preserve, this might be the equivalent of doing a PhD thesis to bring all these areas together, to list what you have and to put forth ideas of what you might do, and to look for funding that would preserve these places for the future. On our plot of land between Rantoul and Paxton, at the north end, there is a Prospect Cemetery. And Paxton at one stage called Prospect. So that's why the name Prospect for the cemetery. But the old cemeteries utilized in settlement time didn't have titles. They were as, and the state has assigned them to mostly township supervisors. And the township supervisors get a lot of static because often the reserve areas that are wonderful for prairie, for remnant prairie, are the target for mowing. And so the Grand Prairie Friends is in process of taking over that situation, as they've had some help in buying it from the township. So they're not certain to say anything about it at the moment, but there's some interesting guesswork there that we are encouraging in the background. It's near the end of the start of Paxton. Paxton is on a Paxton Moraine. It is the tallest moraine between southern Illinois and northern Illinois. And it had to have a steam engine in waiting to help push freight over that hill. And there are railroad beds there that are still within the railroad ownership that widen the opportunity for prairie and especially prairie soils. And Grand Prairie Friends has rented part of this. It's been an area known for many, many years. And it's alive at the present time. There's lead plants, there's liatris, there's purple prairie clover, there's quinine, there's yellow coneflower, purple coneflower, the grasses, and there's also teasel. But we stopped and removed a teasel. It becomes a habit. You can't move past the teasel without you stop and at least hack it down, even if you don't have a herbicide to spot herbicide. But that area has potential for prairie preservation. It also has the potential for that old railroad, the old road, old Route 45, to go up to Paxton and to allow people to have automobiles pull off at certain places. But if you go back to the idea of a trust, we don't know a lot about that area yet. The Department of Transportation, in its own right, enjoys to put millions of tons of gravel stored on that road, so that they have a reason for keeping that road as a part of their functional duties. There are people who still want a mown territory. There is a railroad right away for an interurban, and we don't exactly know who owns what, but we know that it was a light rail and that there's a lot of soil there rather than ballast. And that's where prairie grows. But the Department of Transportation can invade. So on Wednesday, when we were up there, I walked up to that corridor and noticed that, and I knew all the time, that the Department of Transportation is interested in that corridor as a prairie trail. It hasn't happened yet. So what a trust does is let people with different interests come together. And we hope that might be not easy, not without cost. If you involve lawyers in this sort of domain, it can be a very costly business. It involves cities and counties and states sometimes. So as we do this, one of the essential things to do is to let people be educated. So that I came back from that day of work, probably walked at least 5 miles, taking film. I put the film in a chip under the computer. I read all the segments that I'd made, and it was so wonderful. And I was so proud of myself. And somehow I lost the technology I needed to preserve it, and it's gone. And you have to say, well, that's how it is, folks. That happens sometimes. So That's a setback. But we have the opportunity to do pictorial stuff. And we need people like David Witzani, who has been very, very helpful in doing this and helping us getting on the way. But the virus has kind of got in the way. And we haven't got back to normal. But this week, I really have to have this program that I'm presenting now to be a radio program. So you can listen to it on radio, listen to it on your computer, listen to it on YouTube. But we also desperately need it to be a visual program. We need people to see the old Pumpkin Vine line with the Grand Prairie Friends short line at the other end of it. We need to see a little part of prairie here, a little part of prairie there. We need to see the area north of Rantoul, which for 3 generations of Rantoul administrators allowed us to let the prairie grow on that area, which is now mown like a billiard table. And we had to think about taking a trail north to join up with the old Route 45, which goes behind the cemetery. And the cemetery is loaded with history. So you can take a high school group and say, now, what do you think about this person who had 3 wives and 9 children? Or how did he look? What was the history here? Well, it might have been that the train advancing from the Illinois Central, advancing from Chicago, stopped at Ludlow, and the family got out and didn't know how to walk through the prairie and died. It might be little things we need to know about our history so that we could look at this transect from Rantoul up over the Bloomington Moraine, from wet to medium to dry to then the gentle slope down to Ludlow, was a huge grain elevation. And we have to think something about the nature of agriculture. I think we sometimes have visiting students who come here and leave not exactly knowing what the agricultural history is of cattle and sheep, and then row crops, and then the monocrops of corn and soybeans. We have to move from a horse era to an oxen era to a modern tractor that is half the size of a house. And we have to look at drainage and how you continue that drainage, and how you prevent erosion, how the no-till policies help to prevent erosion and hypoxia in the Gulf, where the nitrates and phosphates go down to the Gulf and cause a dead zone. We have to think about new species. It would be nice to have a soybean that was perennial rather than annual, because the annual planting disturbs the soil and creates an opportunity to surface erosion. So we're looking at these variables in the cemetery, and we're looking at a little bit of a highland. And there were some of these part of the moranic geology. Katie Portagrossi, who was mayor for one time, was very worried about a hill which has been developed on the west side of Rantoul, but it was probably involved Indian populations that would be there in summer, but go back to Vermilion County and more protective places in the winter. Katie was very interested in maintaining at least a little of the dignity of that mound. The Bloomington Moraine itself is rolling. So there are some places where there are areas that are take on water in a 5-inch rainfall, but there is no drainage outlet unless you put a pipe underground. So you can talk to farmers who are after a good rain having to replant those sites. But so there's a linear, so you maybe go across the landfill, but you may also go linearly and look at other areas like the forest preserve in the Kerr Township, and it has wetlands with bird life that you can't imagine, and so with these interests partially on the way, it may take 200 years to achieve what we're looking for, but we want people to travel that 10 miles and stop off here and there. I'm sad to have to report that in some places, the area that is owned by the Department of Transportation is where they dump some of their own junk. It was used to be that some of these things got dumped on our gravel pit prairie, and so we're negotiating to bulldoze some of that out. But it's sad to see some of that sort of material might be what you evacuate from under a culvert, the scungy stuff, and it gets dumped there. And so you have to gently have a relationship between the environment and who's working with it and who controls it. Stephanie Dobbs has in charge of roadside maintenance throughout the state. The prison departments create signs that say the no mow territory. The farmers who often are second jobbing as mowing people are sad because they're getting less to mow. The neatnik people think that the mowing is essential, but really it wasn't invented till some Australian, I think, who invented a rotary mower in after World War II, and it became worldwide. And so there is a feeling that there's visual corridor. Often the visual corridor is parallel. It has nothing to do with what's on the side. The visual corridor can be interesting. And we want you to go up that corridor and stop off and scratch in the soil and learn a few of the species and think about programs that we might run that are like the housing program, where we might take some young folk, another generation, to move into this sort of thing and to work with attorneys to have a trust that where we could submit a program and have a legal accounting for what we do in progress instead of just being by the seat of the pants and sometimes loners. I think it's getting time to be off the air. So think beautiful thoughts about the land that you have between St. Joe and Ogden on the Kickapoo Trail, which has the same problems. We don't want to be so wide that there's no prairie or prairie soil left. So onward and upward. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And thank you to WEFT for allowing us to think about the community. And we would like them to think about the visual side of the community as well as the verbal side. And this is Dave Monk. Thanks.